My tastes and preferences in tools and EDC gadgets and stuff like that have changed a lot over the years, some with flashlights and definitely with knives. And as somebody who's carried a pocket knife since, I don't know, I assume I was a young teenager at that point, I wasn't always into fixed blade knives at all when I was younger, and that's been sort of a more recent, in the last few years, thing that I've gotten into. And I was thinking about some of the knives that I've enjoyed using the most, especially this last year, and how that's so different than even just last year, as I was really starting to explore fixed blades and thought that might be a cool thing to talk through with you guys today, just in case other knife guys have been on a similar trajectory or want to weigh in with that. When I first started getting into fixed blades, I started trying larger ones. So I had an Eafengrow 143. This is the 6.5 inch Joker Nomad. Done some videos on all of these. If you like playing with knives and doing stuff outdoors, it's obviously really fun to take a big knife and baton it through a big piece of wood. And when I started doing all that, I was like kind of blown away by just doing that, because I was like, man, I didn't know a knife could do something like that. I would have thought it would chip it or snap it or something. And some of these really robust knives that are capable of that degree of abuse just seemed really awesome, and I really was into the like one knife survival, I guess, fantasy. The idea of like, as I was also starting to get into backpacking and, you know, trail hikes for the day and stuff, the idea of bringing a knife with me that could do everything, that I'm like, you know, chances are slim that I'm going to find myself in a bad scenario, but it's cool to know that if I had a knife like this in my backpack, that I could be ready for anything. Yeah, that's all cool. But over time, I started asking myself, like, where are the lines and differences between, you know, being somebody who often carries a multi-tool with a small knife in it? When I asked myself, like, where would I draw the line between what things a, you know, 2.5 inch blade on, you know, like a Leatherman, when is that sufficient? A fair amount of the time. And then, like, when I need more knife, how much more knife do I necessarily need? Because some of these big knives are pretty heavy. And I was noticing when I would, like, load up my backpack for a hike or something, if I'd put some of these big things in there, it really made a difference in weight. Even just a knife, you know, as weight savings as that is compared to, say, a hatchet, it still made a difference. And then, you know, I started stepping down into smaller fixed blades. So I tried out the Esee 3, really a big fan of this knife. Oddly, I've not yet made a dedicated video just about the Esee 3, which for how much I like it doesn't really make any sense. So I'll have to make it a point to do that. And then after the Esee 3, I also got my hands on the White River Knives Ursus Cub. This is a fantastic knife, and not simply because it's Magna Cut. I know, you know, there might be some who look at that and say, well, sure, it's a $200 knife. It's, you know, one of the best steels on the market. Of course you think it's great. But outside of just the material, everything from the handle ergonomics to the size to the blade shape to how slicey it is are just fantastic. And I would actually say it's probably equally the Esee 3 and the Ursus Cub that have really started to change how I have felt about the fixed blades that I would want to use or carry the most often. And that surprised me at first, just because I was like, you know, hey, I'm into these big 6.5 inch knives. Why would suddenly a 3.5 inch knife seem so appealing? And it struck me as I thought about it that it's like, sure, when you want to do some heavy chopping or batoning or true survival type stuff, a really big knife like this, there's really no replacement for it if you're not going to use a hatchet for that kind of stuff. As a YouTuber, I'm like, how often do I baton through wood when it's not A, just for demonstration for videos that I'm making, or B, if I'm honest, just for fun? Maybe it's an afternoon in the summer where I've got some wood I've got to take care of anyway, and because it's fun to play with knives, I'm like, I'll just baton it or chop it up with the knife, because why not? But then I asked myself, apart from just playing, if you will, how often would you seriously use one of these knives to do chopping and stuff like that versus my hatchet that I have? You know, and if I'm honest, the answer is not really that often. So then I'm like, well, this is obviously a lot of knife to carry for that kind of stuff. And apart from chopping and batoning, what's other stuff that I use a knife for, even when I'm camping or stuff like that? If it's food prep, if it's whittling wood, if it's cutting rope, paracord, zip ties, random stuff when I'm outside working, if I'm honest, probably one of these knives is sufficient most of the time, because when I'm in a scenario where a 2.5-inch blade just isn't going to cut it, you step up into something like this, that's in a lot of cases just enough more knife to do a great job of what I need to do. And the fact that it's a fixed blade and it's full tang means if I have to twist a little bit, I can. That's a lot more comfortable in the hand than holding a Leatherman. So, that gives me something that I'm not getting using a small pocket tool. Even folding knives that I've had, it's a step beyond that in its comfort and its usability. And it's also very light and easy to carry with me everywhere. I have, while I've sort of been in a trial period with this knife, worn it on my belt just about every day in like the 4 weeks since I've gotten my hands on it. And it carries really well, like so well that it's kind of made me rethink that I before was like, I'm not entirely sold on the idea of a fixed blade for EDC. But with this, I'm like, yeah, I could see where it is. And like, I've used this for dinner prep some nights, even in the house. I've used it as my table knife instead of a dedicated. And I figure, why not? I maintain a knife that I use regularly more often than I would some of my kitchen knives. This is one of the sharpest knives that I own. It's in one of the best steels that I own. Why wouldn't I want to use it sometimes at the table for that kind of stuff? And it's so slicey and it works so well for that it's just a knife that is a great all-arounder that I'm like, yeah, this makes sense as something to use for almost everything in my day-to-day. That is a heavier task than something like this. And it's cool to carry both, because then if I'm in public and I'm in mixed company where I feel like, if I pulled my shirt up and was going to pull out a fixed blade, would that make certain people I'm around nervous? If it's going to, well, nobody's really threatened by a multi-tool. Because it's a tool first that has a knife in it, I find that people are a lot less uncomfortable about that. So having this in my pocket also, this is fine for if I need to cut an apple in front of somebody or whatever. But then the rest of the time, when more is okay, this really makes a lot of sense. And I feel like maybe for me, the 3.5-inch to 4.5-inch size in a fixed blade is probably perfect. I hesitate to say that because my tastes are changing so much over the years. But as it stands right now, I feel like that's probably the ideal size, in my opinion, just because when I've used smaller fixed blades that are 2.5 to maybe 3 inches, my feeling was often, I don't know that it adds enough more than what I'm getting with a small folder like this, that it makes sense to carry it when a folding, either multi-tool or a folding knife is just so much easier to carry and more socially acceptable in urban type environments. So to me, it just doesn't make sense to have a knife that's that small, that's a fixed blade. It's no offense to anyone where that's your preference. That's just me. And I've had knives like the 5-inch version of this Nomad. That's really nice as a belt knife for hikes or for camping, but it wouldn't be something that you would carry around the rest of the time. And I feel like this 3.5-inch zone is really where you hug that line of like, it's just on the upper end of what you could probably carry around with you almost every day if you wanted to, and it's still big enough and usable enough to do like heavier duty, knife tasks, and it just cuts really well for a lot of things. And the fact that this has a fire steel on it, I've used this quite a few times to start campfires around my property. It's just a really cool knife. And some of this same evolution and like the kind of stuff that I would want to carry has carried into blade shapes as well. As much as I like the convex edge of a knife like this for chopping, because it makes it a lot more like an axe, it's very durable. I've never gotten a nick in this doing the heaviest duty stuff that I could conceive of realistically doing with a knife. That's super, yes. And in a knife this big, I have no problem with that. But people joke about these being sharpened crowbars, and they're not wrong. I mean, this is incredibly thick. That comes at a cost when you're trying to do some finer carving stuff for food prep. This could do it, sure, but like it wouldn't be as good for that kind of stuff. And you compare it to like an Esee and how much thinner and super slicey this knife is. I just find, once again, back to that same question of, when you're not batoning, when you're not chopping through a big piece of wood with a knife, what's the stuff you're doing the rest of the time? For me personally, I find that a thinner, slicier knife is just all around more useful for basically, quote, real knife stuff. And so I have some knives that I've accumulated over the years that are bigger, heavier, thicker, especially smaller ones. I've talked about that in my videos on the Kaiser hair, that for such a small knife that in many ways seems obvious as an EDC choice, it's also got a pretty thick spine that I think works against it, at least in my opinion, on some of the stuff that you would do with a really small knife that comparatively, even though the SE3 is bigger and not as easy to EDC, I just think this is a phenomenally better knife when it comes to actually using it. It's much slicier. It handles better. In my opinion, much better scenario, and that has informed big time the kind of knives that I would want to carry around with me and use. What do you guys make of that? Put that in the comments. I'm curious, other knife guys, what your evolution has been over the years, your preferences, things like that that you find the most useful to you, whether it's camping, hiking, general outdoor kind of stuff. And if you kind of stagger between using a certain type of fixed blade on a regular basis and also having folding pocket tools, what kind of folding tools do you prefer to use? Do you carry a pocket knife? Do you carry a Leatherman or a Victorinox, something like that? Be really interested to hear what you make of that, and I think that's going to wrap for this video, but I've got more content coming soon. I do want to talk more specifically about the White River Ursus Cub, about it itself, and not just in a general philosophical sense like this video. And like I said, as far as I'm concerned, I still owe you guys a video on the SE3, so more coming on that soon. Thanks for watching.